Hello all, and welcome to English 1020 Online. I am Professor Bergen, and it is my pleasure to be teaching you this semester. Take some time to read up on the syllabus and the schedule of assignments. Every Monday I'm going to post a new topic in the discussions area, and we'll carry on with our discussions there. In addition, I'm planning to upload a video like this one every week to serve as a guide as we try to delve into the readings and learn more about the texts we read. The idea is to subject these readings to some theory of critical analysis, which is the tool we use to unlock the deeper meanings behind a story, poem, or play. On that note, you'll see in the content area a document called Portraits on Criticism. Anytime you see it written in the syllabus that we will be discussing a critical theory like biographical, historical, or Marxist theory, that is your cue to pull up the Portraits on Criticism handout and read about said theory before you approach the assigned text. So in this case, the assigned reading for this week is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and we're going to subject it to biographical criticism. The Yellow Wallpaper is a gritty, surreal short story that concerns a middle-class woman's descent into madness. Oddly enough, despite the fact that the protagonist exhibits obvious signs of mental instability, the people around her do not seem to offer much in the way of help or comfort. In fact, they seem to completely ignore her concerns. And this will certainly have some bearing on our reading as we examine the biographical context of the story. Before we get into that, though, we need to talk about the characters in The Yellow Wallpaper. First, the story is told from the perspective of an unnamed female protagonist, and the narrative is related through a series of diary entries. We know this to be true because the protagonist alludes on page 317 to the fact that she is writing on dead paper, and that gives her a great relief to her mind. Further, on page 319, she says, "There comes my husband John, and I must put this, the diary, away. He hates to have me write a word." So, the protagonist's husband is a man named John, who also happens to be her physician. He is considered to be a highly respected doctor, very knowledgeable, and yet, perhaps because of his reputation, perhaps because of the social norms at the time, he doesn't give much credence to the protagonist's own opinions concerning her health. She says on page 317, "If a physician of high standing and one's own husband assures friends and relatives that there is really nothing the matter with one but temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency, what is one to do?" This couple, who are, at the time of the story, renting out an estate to stay in over the summer, are joined by their newborn child, John's sister Jenny, and a nanny named Mary, who is employed to watch over the baby because the protagonist, in her current condition, cannot be trusted with its care. Another character who is mentioned by name but never appears is Weir Mitchell, a consulting physician whose name will become more important to us later. But for now, it's sufficient to say that the protagonist does not carry a high opinion on Mitchell. So we pick up on The Yellow Wallpaper as the couple are spending the summer in this rented estate. The protagonist has been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and is advised to stay indoors as much as possible and to avoid unnecessary social contact and mental stimulation. This is why she tries to hide her diary from the people around her. The room the protagonist stays in is a nursery that has been converted to a bedroom. There are bars around the windows. The bed is nailed to the floor, and the wallpaper is this sickly pale yellow color with agitating, wandering floral patterns. It isn't long before the protagonist, who really has nothing else to do with her time, begins to notice some quirks about the wallpaper. She describes it in detail on page 318. It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study. And when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard-of contradictions. This wallpaper, you will notice, quickly becomes a focal point in the story, as it takes on increasingly humanistic characteristics the more the protagonist stares at it. Page 320. There is a recurrent spot where the pattern lolls like a broken neck, and two bulbous eyes stare at you upside down. I get positively angry with the impertinence of it and the everlastingness. Up and down and sideways they crawl, and those absurd, unblinking eyes are everywhere. Later on, as the story progresses, the protagonist becomes convinced that amongst the lame, uncertain curves, the broken necks, the bulbous eyes, she can actually make out the figure of a person in the wallpaper. No, not just a person, but a woman, and not just a woman, but a woman who is trapped inside the wallpaper and very much desires to get out. On page 325, I didn't realize for a long time what the thing was that showed behind that dim sub-pattern. But now I'm quite sure it is a woman. Page 327. The front pattern does move, and no wonder. The woman behind shakes it. Sometimes I think there are a great many women behind, and sometimes only one, and she crawls around fast, and her crawling shakes it all over. Then in the very bright spots, she keeps still. In the very shady spots, she just takes hold of the bars and shakes them hard. And she is all the time trying to climb through. This discovery leads to something of a transformation in the protagonist's character. First, she becomes very distrustful of the people in the house, of John and Jenny, and she actively works to safeguard her secrets from them. She begins to disassociate with them and seems to relate more to the woman in the wallpaper than to the actual living people in the house. Next, this discovery seems to have given her a new sense of purpose, and she says on page 325, "Life is very much more exciting now than it used to be. You see, I have something more to expect, to look forward to watch." This is a secret that she cannot afford to let John spoil, for she concocts a scheme to free the woman in the wall by tearing off the paper. She starts with small patches of paper at first, then tears increasingly more, then more after that. And you feel the desperation in her tone as she senses the clock is ticking down on her plan. Page 327. There are only 2 more days to get this paper off, and I believe John is beginning to notice. I don't like the look in his eyes. The closing sequence, where the protagonist finally shows her handiwork to John, is quite dreadful to read, and I think I'd do it disservice by attempting to narrate it here. It's really something you should behold for yourselves, and I won't ruin the experience for you. Suffice it to say that, by the end of the story, we will have witnessed the protagonist's gradual but total descent into madness, and we can't help but feel sympathetic for her. I won't make it a point to obsess too much over the technical details of the story, but I think we should spend a little time talking about how the story achieves its feel and its tone. To begin with, Yellow Wallpaper is written in first-person perspective. It makes use of the epistolary form, which is to say it is a story related in diary entries, and it's narrated in present tense. The combination of these factors makes for a narrative that continually pulls the reader in, because when things are said to be happening in real time, there is a greater urgency behind the action. When the protagonist says, "There is John at the door," or "There is Jenny at the stairs," we may believe that the actual event is unfolding and we have no recourse but to simply observe. Further, there's a great deal of symbolism at play in the story. Symbolism is when an element of a story is meant to refer to another thing. Everything from the bars on the window, which symbolize imprisonment, to the color of the wallpaper, yellow being a color associated with sickness in Gilman's time, has meaning. All of these details lead to a deeper, more satisfying reading of the text. But in order to get the most out of the Yellow Wallpaper, we're going to have to visit the biography of the author. A small caveat before we begin. It is not my intention to say that every text we will read this semester is the clear projection of an author's biography. It's not my intention to say that every text can be read as autobiographical or that it can be telling of an author's life. Authors are certainly allowed to evoke what we call artistic license, imagination, and we have to be careful not to read every detail of a story as a reflection of the author's own life experience. In Gilman's case, however, the biographical context is quite important for our understanding of the Yellow Wallpaper because, in a way, Gilman openly acknowledges that she has painted her own suffering into the protagonist of the story. Gilman, like the protagonist of the story, suffered from a nervous disorder following the birth of her child, what was initially called neurasthenia, but is now known to be postpartum depression. And she was prescribed a treatment very similar to the one seen in the Yellow Wallpaper. You will recall that the protagonist was forbidden from any mental stimulation at all and was more or less confined to one room throughout the story. This treatment actually has a name. It's called the rest cure, and it was, believe it or not, a popular treatment for neurasthenia in Gilman's time. So at this point, I'd like to refer to our Portraits on Criticism handout. I'm going to read an excerpt from the biographical section, which comes to us by way of the French critic Charles-Augustin Sainte-Beuve. He says, "For me, literature, literary production, is not distinct, or at least not separable, from the rest of the man and from its environment. I can enjoy a work, but I can hardly judge it, independently of a knowledge of the man himself, or woman herself. In the late 1800s, there was a great deal of confusion regarding matters of mental health. The field was still in its infancy, and psychotherapy had not even been conceived, so therefore anxiety disorders such as the ones seen in this story were thought to be caused by physiological factors like weight loss, blood flow. Silas Weir Mitchell, who is referenced by name in the Yellow Wallpaper, was one of the physicians who, in Gilman's time, advocated for the rest cure and believed that nervous disorders could be cured by a system of forced rest, massage therapy, and a high-calorie diet. So when the protagonist of the Yellow Wallpaper says on page 325 that I really do eat better, we know this seemingly random detail is connected to an actual practice in Gilman's time. The rest cure may have seemed sensible to somebody like Mitchell, but it was another matter entirely to actually experience the cure for oneself. Many women at the time had an unfavorable opinion of the cure due to its association with force feeding and other unethical practices. Gilman, as I mentioned earlier, was one such woman who underwent the cure, the rest cure, and lived to tell or write the tale. In a way, the Yellow Wallpaper can be considered a treatise against the cure, for as soon as the manuscript was finished, Gilman sent a copy of the Yellow Wallpaper to Mitchell, her physician, to read. Whether or not the story had an impact on Mitchell is left to the imagination, but it's unlikely that in Mitchell's time, Gilman's medical opinion would have been valued as highly as Mitchell's. Medicine was a male-dominated frontier in the 1800s, and just as the protagonist's concerns are dismissed by her husband in the story, Mitchell would have been seen as the authority on the subject. It's interesting to note that Mitchell did not prescribe the rest cure to all patients suffering from nervous disorders. In fact, for male patients, treatment usually took the opposite route. Instead of enforcing bed rest, Mitchell promoted robust activities like cattle roping and hunting and time spent outdoors. In a way, this had the effect of reinforcing 19th century gender stereotypes, as Mitchell thought the only way to cure a woman was to remove her from the social sphere and treat her in her natural state, the home. Gilman writes that her doctors sent her home with the solemn advice to live as domestic a life as possible. This realization has made the Yellow Wallpaper a popular target for feminist criticism. So this has been an example of how we can apply biographical criticism to the Yellow Wallpaper. Keep these observations in mind as we go forward with the discussions this semester. I hope you'll consider applying this critical method and the other ones we talk about to the literature.